Well, Australia's career politicians, which is 99% of them, don't get many opportunities to exude gravitas these days. Guided by party spivs whose defining characteristics are caution and cowardice, politicians are usually confined to the relatively uncontroversial job of promising to give people supposedly free services while carefully avoiding getting lured into debates about traditionally important things like freedom of speech or the benefits of a strong, unified culture based on Christian values. That would draw criticism from leftist journalists that few politicians have the intellect to debunk. But even these politicians know they need to display leadership qualities occasionally, which is why so many of them couldn't get a Ukrainian flag up on their social media profiles quick enough on the 24th of February 2022, when Russian tanks rolled across Ukraine's eastern border. Scott Morrison, who was Prime Minister at the time, said Australia would join with other allies in ensuring Russia paid a heavy cost for the invasion. Opposition leader Anthony Albanese said Labor had a, quote, clear position of solidarity with the people of Ukraine, and said Russia was trampling fundamental principles. Albo won the Australian federal election 3 months later and is now promising to support Ukraine for, quote, as long as it takes. He has sent Ukraine more than $1 billion worth of military equipment and coal to help defeat those evil Russians. Not to be left behind, opposition leader Peter Dutton has described Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelensky as a 21st century hero. And this year criticised Labor's military support for Ukraine as being, quote, too slow and weak. Well, the audacity of this grandstanding should have been apparent from the start. Not only is Ukraine the most corrupt nation in Europe and the disputes over its eastern territory centuries old, but the principles of freedom and democracy our leaders were supposedly espousing for a country on the other side of the world didn't seem to apply here in their own backyard. The same people who joined the fight for freedom in Ukraine were at the same time telling Australians that if they wanted to enjoy freedoms they once took for granted, they first needed to be jabbed with an experimental vaccine whose manufacturers had been paid undisclosed billions of dollars and given indemnity for the deaths and injuries those vaccines would inevitably cause. And since then, their contempt for freedom has been compounded by their bipartisan support for legislation that empowers government-appointed apparatchiks to jail anybody who disagrees with the government's agenda. This hypocrisy managed to fly under the radar, however, because the media has as much interest vested in vaccines and censorship as the political class does. So, with a wink and a nod, the media led it through to the keeper. It wasn't until this month that politicians were finally forced to pay some sort of price for blithely jumping aboard the Ukraine bandwagon. Russia's proposal to build an Airforce base on Biak Island in Indonesia, a mere 1,300 kilometres from Darwin, looks typical of the highly personal 3D chess moves that President Vladimir Putin likes to play and is very good at. You thought you could get involved in Central Europe? How about I make a move in Southeast Asia? You can bet that panic buttons were pressed in Canberra when party hacks realised that the cheap domestic benefits from supporting a war on the other side of the world might be overshadowed by Russian bombers being hosted by our nearest neighbour and putative ally. Any doubt that Australia had naively promoted itself to the big table of international militaristic brinkmanship was dispelled when Putin's ambassador to Indonesia, Sergei Tolkanov, wrote a piece in the Jakarta Post on April 19 saying, with deference to Donald Trump's blunt message to Zelensky in February, that Australia was indeed in the game, but, quote, has no cards, unquote. Well, Albo was quick to prove him wrong on that point by playing the only card he had, the Joker. He accused Russia of spreading propaganda and said the opposition's demands for an explanation were akin to conspiracy theories about the moon landing. It was almost enough to make patriotic Australians start supporting Putin. Not because Putin is a good guy, but he at least knows what he's talking about. Tolkanov was right. Australia doesn't have any cards. You might have thought that opening Australia's borders to every Sanjay, Imran and Vihan who wanted to move from Mumbai to Melbourne, or the $300 million plus that we give in aid to Indonesia every year, might have carried some kudos, but not at this table where they play for ranches instead of hobby farms, which is essentially what Australia has become since we started shutting down our power stations and stopped producing anything other than fake invalids who bludge off the NDIS. Both sides of Australian politics are relieved that the Russian bases story has been buried beneath more trivial issues that better suit their skills. Neither side of politics can muster any respect at home, let alone among world leaders.